my channel. Hey yo, listen up, yeah. Hey yo, the Wireless Woman.
You in charge of the girls, right?
I am in charge of the girls.
Are you in charge of the girls?
I am in charge of the girls.
Okay.
I'm going to do what I normally do, which is chase several squirrels today. But I promise before the end of this podcast, I'm going to make sense. And I'm going to make my point. And it's a point that's so necessary to make at a time like this that I'm willing to chase it around the yard a little bit just to make sure that I'm understood. So there is a new show on Netflix. It's like the Jeffrey Dahmer show. And people keep asking me if I've watched it. I watched the first episode and I was so creeped out and weirded out by the concept really of what was going on that I kind of couldn't commit to watching the whole thing. I got into the second episode and it was a little bit more benign than the first episode, but I could see how they were building sympathy for Jeffrey Dahmer, because you just can't have a protagonist, period, that is so vile and evil and disconnected from the human experience that people can't find themselves in this particular protagonist. Now listen, I promise you, what I'm about to say is going to sound super wild, but I am going somewhere if you will just follow me to where I'm going. Even if you don't agree with me, I think what I'm saying, though, will make sense. I think it has merit. I think it's valid. So just go with me. So I was around when the whole Jeffrey Dahmer thing was happening. I had him like completely confused with like another serial killer, evidently, because I didn't remember that he was gay and poor. However, I could tell in this miniseries, this series that they've done on Netflix, that they were going to build a lot of sympathy for who he was as a character in the setup in the first episode. So I was like, I don't know if I can follow this whole series down. But I went back to an interview that they did on Inside Edition about Jeffrey Dahmer. And there was this white anchor man, and then there was this white woman who had been sent in to interview Jeffrey Dahmer, and she spoke at great lengths about how intelligent and articulate he was, how easy he was to talk to. And she looks at the camera and she says, "Does this look like the face of evil? Does this look like the face of a murderer?"
How did Jeffrey Dahmer get away with murder after murder for 13 years? How did a boy born into a hard-working middle-class family turn into the worst kind of monster imaginable? The reason why Jeffrey Dahmer was able to get away with his crimes was because of just what you are seeing here. Jeffrey Dahmer is intelligent and articulate. That is what makes him so frightening.
It's funny because the biggest thing that allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to continue to do what he was doing in a black neighborhood was his whiteness, was the fact that people felt that evil just couldn't be something that came out of what they considered to be a middle America educated white young man, especially the type of violence that they had grown accustomed to being a part of the black community anyway. More than likely it was one of us who had killed each other and not this innocent white man. Now you see a complete opposite of that when black people are killed or murdered, because they say, well, what did he do? Well, he probably fit a description. So this whole Jeffrey Dahmer thing, you know, people are bringing this guy to the police, but because they can't fathom evil in white skin, they're like, this is probably a misunderstanding. You know, they gave one kid back to him and let him kill him. So what I think is so interesting about it is Jeffrey Dahmer looks like white cops that kill black people. He looks like white people that burn crosses in black people's yards. He looked like the white mob that came into Rosewood and burned that to the ground. He looks like white lawmakers that make laws that keep black people in prison. He looked like colonizers. He looked like people who have raped and pillaged villages of people. He looks like people who have displaced whole continents of people, taking their land from them, giving them blankets that are laden with smallpox. He looks like the type of people that come down in the slave quarters and rape black women and black men, who have threatened black men with violence to beat black women. Just like in the case of Fannie Lou Hamer, when white jailers forced black men to beat her up.
I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush.
Jeffrey Dahmer looks like white people who have committed the most terroristic, evil, despicable atrocities in human history. And here's the thing, we've been integrated as black people into white society. Like, this is not like I hate white people thing. People who know me personally know that's not the case. However, the same way we don't want to learn about critical race theory, we have taken this chapter, this bloody, evil, diabolical, debaucherous chapter in American history and cloaked it in the civil rights movement and cloaked it in integration, and forgotten that some of the same people who have murdered people, you know, white doctors that said black people couldn't feel pain and did all types of medical experiments on them, black women who were sterilized for the sake of gynecology as a study, you know, black men like the Tuskegee experiment, where these men were given syphilis and placebos and allowed to die.
Why do you bring this rage to my doorstep?
I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Like, I know I'm on a roll, but I've been gone for 2 months. So I think you could give me 2 minutes. All right, 2 minutes. I'm going to bring it around town. Bring it around town. I promise.
If you could just go ahead and make sure you do that from now on, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, I was just checking. So it was the Tuskegee syphilis study. That's what they call it now. The syphilis study. Like, these people that looked just like Jeffrey Dahmer were people that felt like black people should not use their bathrooms, that were able in their superior humanness to see black people as 3/5 of a person. And we forget. And we as black people have been so traumatized in this country that we actually think we are the ones who need the therapy. We think we are the ones that are dealing with the effects of systemic racism and trauma, as if the group of people who could commit these types of atrocities are not themselves mentally ill. And when we see things happening in white America, we don't necessarily look at it as their reckoning, because they live in so much privilege that even when we see things like mass shootings, school shootings that plague predominantly their community, we still see it as like, we have this Stockholm syndrome where we still see it as like all of us, like it happened to all of us, and not really see it as a part of their culture. Like they see violence and drug addiction and drug abuse as being a part of our culture. We see how when drug abuse happened to them in a wide scale, it was like new rules. So I say this to say, because, you know, I tell you, to me, misogyny is really just racism's sexy cousin. I feel like we as women have forgotten the history that brought us to this point. We're talking about gender wars when what I think we've got here is a buildup of gender resistance. I think when there's any group of people that's genuinely oppressed, there is this cognitive dissonance that happens where we either have to beat them or join them. Listen, I myself have been married twice, and I don't want any of my mother's 4 marriages or either of my grandmother's 2. We act like things will be better if we continue, if we integrate, if we continue the traditions, but the men that we have today are no different than the men that have come before them. I know, stick with me. It's not a bash, but it is a read. Our grandmothers put up with stuff they didn't want to put up with because they had to, because women didn't have a place or a stake in the world to be able to stand independently on their own, beside and apart from what men could do for them. And these women worked more often than not. I'm talking about black women here. Paid the bills while granddad drunk up all the money. And they did it quietly and they did it silently. And they told their daughters, go to school, keep the babies in heaven, focus on yourself. And then our moms got out in the world. They made it halfway. You know, they weren't 14 and 15 when they got married. They were 19 and 20 and 21. And they found out that it was a man's world and it was a cruel place. And they still didn't quite have what it took and what they needed to be independent. So you know what they did? They sent us to college. They told us, they said, hey, listen, get out here and make something for yourselves. You know, as women, we have come to a place in time that's been built on the backs of a lot of women. A lot of women. There were women in those ghettos, in those projects in the 80s, watching their teenage sons sell crack to the community. And they were, if you listen to like Tupac songs, if you listen to Biggie songs, these women were putting their sons out the house. These women were putting their foot down and saying, I raised you to be more than this. I raised you to be better than this. And I would like to submit that what crack was to black men in the 80s, white women, white girls, is what black men are being derailed by in this day. Foreign women, you know, just access. Crack, drugs gave black men access to wealth. You know, they could be Tony Montana. They could be in these spaces where they could even turn around and take care of their mom with drug money. And a lot of mothers rejected this. A lot of mothers wanted better for their sons and their daughters than this. But this is debauchery that's been coming down the line through the generations. We're not in a place where marriage and having a man is a prize anymore. But if we're honest with ourselves, it never was.
I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok.
It never was. Most of us, if we grew up with a dad, we know that our moms were single parents because that's just what society called for. It called for a woman to be everything except free, everything except independent. She had to cook, clean, take care of you, kids, dad, parents, community, and then still come home and relinquish all of her power, all of her autonomy, all of her hopes, dreams, and aspirations to whatever the will of her man was. And here's the thing, our community reflects that. Like, even if I'm dead wrong and it seems like I'm hating and I'm bashing, our community reflects the value systems that our matriarchy has had. And I believe that what has held us back as a people for so long has been women not being willing to take their rightful place, at least at this point in history. I'm not asking us to change anything that we do. I'm just asking us to change the reasons why we do it.
Section leaders, what is our concept?
One band, one sound.
One band, one sound.